So the Colorado Supreme Court says that anyway, forgets about the Brandenburg stuff, and in a 4-3 ruling, and interestingly, the 3 judges who dissented did not dissent on the basis that he wasn't involved in the insurrection. They ignored that entirely, and they went right to the procedural grounds, which is what has happened in every other state. I think one state, maybe Michigan, said, no, this just doesn't work. The other states kicked it out on procedural grounds. They didn't really deal with the meat of the matter. So let's bring in constitutional scholar, University of North Carolina law professor Michael Gerhardt. You'll remember him. He testified before Congress during the impeachment. So far, Professor, did I screw anything up?
No, you've not.
All right, good. So let's just deal with what matters most to the folks at home. Does this stand, and do you believe Trump does not get on the primary ballot in Colorado?
I think it's my guess, it's my speculation that the Supreme Court of the United States is likely to take this case. And that's because, for some of the reasons you've already pointed out, this is a big deal. And there are real consequences here. And the consequences here are different than if Trump had been allowed on the ballot. But saying categorically you can't even get on the ballot may be the kind of harm that will catch the Supreme Court's attention and identify a problem the Supreme Court will try to decide.
And this does smack of what you and I lived through in Bush v. Gore, where
Right.
Anthony Kennedy wound up coming on the side of the majority and said, look, we got to stay out of this. Elections are messy, but they're not our business. The process and the people will decide. Does this smack of that for you?
Yes, I think this is very similar to Bush versus Gore in the way you just described. In Bush versus Gore, one of the big questions was whether or not the Supreme Court should, in a sense, overrule what the Florida Secretary of State had concluded.
Right.
Ultimately, what the Supreme Court decided was to let her decision stand. And in this circumstance, I think one of the critical questions the court would identify is whether or not the court itself should be the institution deciding this matter, or perhaps Congress should decide it, or we'll leave it to the states.
Right.
But the court's not going to want to take the responsibility for a final judgment here because it's going to get slammed either way.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's unlikely that they leave it to the states because you don't want different standards when it comes to a constitutional provision. But, when I picked this out for the Chris Cuomo Project podcast back in August, you were actually one of the people I was going to try to get to come on to talk to me about it. But I was throwing it out there as a political mechanism because I didn't understand how it really worked as a function of law. So let's describe why to people. The idea of whether or not it applies to the president, the idea of what self-executing means, and how you would establish insurrection and a fact-finding of whether or not somebody was guilty of it when or involved in one, or are they not talking about a crime?
Right. Well, I think to begin with, the question about whether or not the president is covered by this statute is, at least in my view, a very straightforward matter. What happened in the court below is the court below said that, no, we've read some scholarship and we think that that phrase, officer of the United States, does not include the president. The consequence of that reading is that this statute, right in the aftermath of the Civil War, does not include the president or the vice president for being disqualified, but only would apply to senators and members of representatives and people who work beneath the president. I think that even that interpretation sounds so absurd that it almost refutes itself. And I think instead, what that language clearly is meant to convey is that the president is an officer of the United States and would be one of the people that would be effectively ineligible to serve in another capacity such as president. And as far as Trump is concerned, one of the other issues that's going to come up in the Supreme Court case has to do with whether or not Trump does portray himself, like you said, as a victim here.
Hey, thank you for watching. Please go to newsnationnow.com, newsnationnow.com, and you can find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button down below. Then you will get more of NewsNation's fact-driven coverage.